Four men, dressed in dull gray overalls, attacked a billionaire in a fancy restaurant. However, they stopped dead in their tracks when they realized who was sitting at the table. Quiet. Everyone, phones down. The commanding voice rang out through the refined atmosphere of La Mirage, one of the most expensive spots in Manhattan. The men had just locked the door, trapping everyone inside. Sitting at her favorite corner table, Emma Westbrook, the CEO of Westbrook Technologies and one of the wealthiest women in the country, didn't immediately grasp what was happening. She was enjoying a solo dinner when suddenly, a gun barrel was pressed against her back. "Transfer $50 million into our account right now, or we'll start shooting your rich friends," whispered the leader of the robbers, a burly man with a scar running across his cheek. At the next table, a black teenager of about 15 was calmly eating his burger. He wore a worn school uniform, with a faded backpack resting by his feet. He seemed completely oblivious to the chaos erupting around him. "Hey, kid," one of the robbers barked, pointing his gun at the phone on the table. "You deaf or just stupid?" The teenager, named Elijah King, looked up slowly. There was no fear in his eyes, only a disturbingly calm expression, as if he were more accustomed to being in dangerous situations than sitting at a dinner table. "I'm listening," Elijah said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I was just finishing my meal," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. "My mom always said, never waste food, because someone somewhere is going hungry." At the mention of his mother, something flickered in Elijah's eyes, a painful memory momentarily surfacing. 3 months ago, his mother, Detective Claire King, had died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, the cause of death was a sudden stroke. But Elijah knew better. His mother had been investigating a corruption scandal that led to powerful figures at the top, and her death was no accident. The memories of her teaching him about survival came flooding back. "Always observe, Elijah," she had said. "The surroundings, the exits, the weak spots. Don't ever let them take you by surprise." Elijah's gaze subtly scanned the restaurant, taking in every detail. The leader of the robbers chuckled. "What a funny kid," he sneered, stepping closer to the teenager. "Let's see how funny you are after I—" "Sir," Elijah interrupted, his voice unwavering. "You've got about 4 minutes and 32 seconds before the police arrive. The silent alarm was triggered the moment you locked that door." The leader froze, a look of disbelief creeping onto his face. "How do you know that?" "Simple observation," Elijah replied. "The manager tapped his watch 3 times when you walked in. Panic code. I read about it in a security manual my mom used to bring home." For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader broke into a cruel, mocking laugh. "Look at this. A little genius. Thinks he's smarter than us." He turned to Emma. "Transfer the money, or this kid gets a bullet to the head." Emma's hands shook as she reached for her phone, her eyes briefly meeting Elijah's. The teenager blinked slowly, then looked at the chandelier overhead, then to the fire extinguisher on the wall. The subtle shift in his gaze didn't go unnoticed. He was sending her a message. Emma's instincts kicked in. This boy was no ordinary bystander. He was someone who had been trained, someone who knew how to handle a situation like this. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. "Wait," she said, finding her voice. "I need my tablet to process the transfer. It's in my bag. Don't try anything." The leader growled, stepping back slightly. And that was when Elijah moved. It wasn't a reckless move. It was precise, calculated. Elijah's movements were as fluid as a seasoned fighter. One moment he was sitting. The next, he kicked the table leg with expert precision, sending the plate flying into the leader's face. A man screamed, temporarily blinded by a splash of hot sauce. Elijah didn't waste time. He grabbed the nearest chair and threw it at the chandelier above them. Glass and crystals exploded, raining down on the robbers. The restaurant descended into chaos. "Back exit now," Elijah shouted to Emma, who hesitated for only a second before following his lead. The robbers were disoriented. Their weapons, once threats, were now a hindrance. They could no longer target the hostages with any certainty. One of them fired into the ceiling in a desperate attempt to regain control, but Elijah was already moving again. He grabbed the fire extinguisher on the wall and unleashed a powerful stream of foam directly into the face of the nearest gunman. The man staggered, blinded, coughing and gasping for air. "Damn kid," another robber shouted, charging forward. But Elijah's training kicked in. He fought with the precision of someone who had studied martial arts and combat strategy for years. Every punch, every block, every counterattack was executed with military precision. The burly thug crumpled to the floor, his arm twisted painfully behind his back. Elijah didn't stop. He backed away, maintaining his distance, his eyes calculating. "You guys really picked the wrong restaurant," he said, his voice still calm, almost polite. "And you definitely picked the wrong person to mess with." The leader, wiping hot sauce from his eyes, now saw Elijah clearly for the first time. His posture, the way he moved, there was something unsettling about the teenager. The calmness, the efficiency, it was all too familiar. Who the hell are you?" he stammered. Elijah didn't answer. His focus was now on the entrance, where sirens were beginning to wail. 4 minutes and 35 seconds, he muttered under his breath, almost as if talking to himself. Emma, now safely near the kitchen, watched in awe. This wasn't just a lucky escape. This boy, who she had assumed was a regular student dining alone, had single-handedly defused a dangerous situation. Elijah glanced back at the robbers, his eyes cold and calculating. "You've got about 3 minutes before my colleagues arrive," he said, checking his wrist like an experienced strategist. "I suggest you drop your weapons now." The leader laughed nervously. "Colleagues? What are you talking about?" Elijah smiled, but it wasn't a smile of a teenager. It was a smile of someone who had seen and experienced things no child should have. "My mom was Detective Claire King," he said, his voice steady. "She spent years serving this country. If you knew what she knew, you'd realize how much of a mistake you've just made." The robbers froze. Elijah's mother had been a force in law enforcement, and it seemed they had underestimated the family's reach. As Elijah said this, the kitchen door opened, revealing 3 men who appeared completely out of place in a restaurant. They were well-built, wearing civilian clothes, but their posture, like military operatives, was unmistakable. They didn't say a word. They simply moved into position, surrounding the robbers with a deadly calm. The leader's face drained of color as he recognized the unmistakable signs of military training. "Drop your weapons," ordered the oldest of the 3 men. His voice was firm, the kind that brooked no argument. "Hands on your heads." The robbers had no choice but to comply, realizing they had made a catastrophic mistake. Elijah turned back to his table and picked up his backpack. As he rifled through it, Emma glimpsed the contents, a series of documents, surveillance photos, and a notebook labeled Operation Justice. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This teenager wasn't a random diner. Elijah King had come to La Mirage with a plan, and it had unfolded with military precision. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, Ms. Westbrook," Elijah said politely, his tone as casual as if nothing had happened. "I hope we can chat after the police finish their report. I have a few questions about your connection to Blackstone Defense." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Blackstone Defense, the private defense contractor with multi-million-dollar military contracts, was exactly the kind of company Elijah's mother had been investigating. Emma barely noticed the chaos unfolding around her as the police arrived and secured the scene. She was too busy trying to process what had just happened. This was no ordinary teenage hero. Elijah wasn't some lucky bystander who had stumbled upon an armed robbery. No, he was prepared. Elijah had taken down 4 armed robbers and dismantled their entire operation in under 5 minutes. And now, he was talking about Blackstone Defense as if he already knew everything about her ties to the company. As the police processed the robbers, Elijah stood by, waiting for his moment. He gave Emma a cold, measured glance before turning to leave. "Don't try to run," he called over his shoulder. "We have people watching every exit in the city." Emma's blood turned cold. This wasn't a simple child seeking revenge for his mother's death. This was a well-coordinated, calculated operation, a message, perhaps, that there was far more at stake than a robbery. As she watched Elijah disappear into the crowd, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that her empire, her fortune, was about to come crashing down. The question was no longer about what had happened at La Mirage, but about what Elijah King was planning next. And more importantly, what she had just underestimated. Block 4. The next day, Emma sat in her office, still shaken by the events at La Mirage. She had managed to shake off the initial shock and summon her usual resolve, but now she was terrified. Elijah had made a point. A big one. She had received a message just before lunch, one that made her freeze in place. It was from an unknown number, and the message was simple, chilling. Hello, Ms. Westbrook. Thank you for not mentioning our agreement to the police. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. at the cafe on 5th Avenue. We need to talk about Blackstone Defense and your involvement with certain deals that go far beyond what you think. Emma's hand trembled as she read the message, but the fear didn't set in until she received a follow-up almost immediately. By the way, I already know everything. Let's see how far you're willing to go to keep your secrets hidden. We'll talk tomorrow. Her mind raced, trying to understand how this boy could know so much about her dealings, her private life, the shady contracts that had built her empire. Who are you really? She whispered to herself, staring at the phone screen in horror. But deep down, she already knew. Elijah King wasn't just a grieving son. He was a force of nature, a weapon forged in the most brutal of circumstances. And now, she was his target. She had no choice but to meet him. But what could she possibly say to someone like him? Someone who had already outplayed her at every turn. The world was closing in on Emma Westbrook, and there was no escape from the storm Elijah King had started. My father spent 3 years discreetly investigating you, Elijah continued, stirring his hot chocolate lazily. He created 47 fake identities to infiltrate shell companies. He traced transactions through 12 tax havens. He recorded 89 hours of compromising conversations. Emma's throat tightened. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The walls of her empire, built carefully and solidly over decades, were crumbling piece by piece, as this teenager laid out her worst fears with chilling precision. You're lying, she managed to force out, but her voice cracked. Elijah smiled, but it wasn't the innocent grin of a teenager. It was a predatory smile, one that told her he knew exactly how to dismantle her life. Of course you do, he said, his voice calm. That's why you had my father killed. The accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. Her mind screamed that it couldn't be true, that there was no way this boy could have gathered such evidence. But the confidence in his voice was unshakable. Your father's autopsy didn't show anything, Emma said, trying to steady herself. There's no proof he was murdered. Elijah's smile grew colder. That's because the poison they used, digitalis, is virtually undetectable in routine tests. But my father knew how to look for it. A private autopsy confirmed it. With a practiced movement, Elijah slid a thin folder across the table. This is a copy. The originals are safely stored in 17 secure locations. I made sure of it. Emma's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were medical reports, toxicology results, and even photos of her late husband during the autopsy. It was all there, the evidence she never thought anyone could get. Her world felt as if it were breaking apart in real time. What do you want? She whispered, her voice barely a breath. Justice, Elijah replied, his voice as cold as steel. My father dedicated 30 years to serving this country. He was killed because he uncovered the truth. He found out what you were doing, profiting from the deaths of American soldiers, selling them defective equipment, and pocketing the difference. Emma's lips parted, but no words came. She had seen men like Elijah before, driven by vengeance, anger, and a thirst for justice. But never in her wildest dreams did she think it would be a 15-year-old boy sitting across from her, wielding the power to destroy everything she had worked for. I could destroy you, she finally spat, regaining some of her composure. You're a minor. This evidence was illegally obtained. It would never hold up in court. I have enough money to make sure you never see the inside of a courtroom. Elijah didn't flinch. You're right, he said calmly. The courts could be complicated. That's why I'm not going to use them. He opened his backpack and pulled out a laptop. His fingers tapped a few keys, and within moments, he turned the screen around to reveal a website, an investigative blog with millions of followers. The banner at the top read, "The Truth Behind the Lies, Exposing Corporate Corruption." This is Kenneth Morrison, Elijah said, tapping the screen. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Former Marine who served under my father. This blog has millions of subscribers. One word from him. And tomorrow morning, 12 million people will wake up to the story of the billionaire who killed a general. Emma's face went pale. She could feel the walls closing in. You can't prove anything. I didn't. Elijah interrupted her, his voice cutting through her denial like a knife. You won't need to prove it in court, Ms. Westbrook. I just need to raise enough suspicion. Media scandal, federal investigation, panic among your shareholders, stock prices plummeting. By the time the sun sets tomorrow, your empire will be in ashes. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking with hers. And you'll experience exactly what my father did, watching everything you built get destroyed and being powerless to stop it. Emma's heart raced. This wasn't just a boy grieving his father's death. This was a man, an army, a force of nature, playing a game she didn't even know the rules of. She could feel her grip on power slipping away. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. Elijah leaned forward, his gaze hardening. "You'll transfer 51% of Blackstone Defense shares to a fund controlled by veterans, men and women who fought under my father's command. You'll publicly resign from the board, citing irreconcilable ethical differences. You'll make the transfer today, or you'll face the consequences." "That's extortion," she gasped, her mind reeling from the audacity of his demands. "No," Elijah corrected her. "That's restitution." He stood up and dropped a $5 bill on the table for his hot chocolate. "You have 48 hours to comply. Or, by 6 a.m. tomorrow, the whole world will know the truth. Your truth." As he turned to leave, Emma managed to find her voice, her breath coming in shallow gasps. How? How did a 15-year-old boy do all of this? Elijah paused at the door and looked back at her. His expression softened, but only for a moment, before his eyes hardened again. "My father started training me when I was 6, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Military strategy, forensic analysis, computer programming, cryptography. He knew one day he wouldn't be here to protect me. So he prepared me for everything. This is what he trained me for." A single tear rolled down Elijah's cheek, but he wiped it away angrily, as though it was a sign of weakness. "You didn't just kill my father, Ms. Westbrook. You created the very instrument of your own destruction." And with that, he left, leaving Emma sitting alone, the weight of her past actions crashing down on her. The empire she had spent decades building was no longer just at risk. It was already crumbling. Block 7. The next morning, Emma received another envelope at her office, one that sent her heart into overdrive. Inside, there was a single photo of her leaving the building where her personal lawyer lived, taken less than an hour ago. On the back, in elegant cursive, a message. "Ms. Westbrook, every move you make is being watched. Every phone call is being heard. You can still choose how this ends, but you must act quickly." The message sent a chill down her spine. How could he possibly know where she was? And how much was he tracking? But before she could react, her private investigator, Mitchell Barnes, called. "Ms. Westbrook," he said nervously, "I found something disturbing about the boy." "Go on," Emma demanded. "He's not alone. We've identified at least 12 military veterans working for him. They're taking turns guarding him. One of them is James Rodriguez, a cyber warfare expert who worked under your late husband in the Middle East." Emma felt the floor drop from beneath her. 12, she whispered. "And that's just what you've identified?" Barnes hesitated, his voice faltering. "Ms. Westbrook, this isn't a traumatized teenager seeking revenge. This is a military operation. General King had already prepared his son to take on the most powerful people in the country." The realization hit Emma like a freight train. Elijah King had a network of soldiers behind him, ready to back him up at every step. Trying to eliminate him now would be suicidal. There was only one option left. She had to discredit him, publicly, before it was too late. "Activate the public relations team," she ordered, her voice tight with desperation. "I want a full smear campaign. We'll paint him as a disturbed kid, obsessed with conspiracy theories. A potential danger to society." But Elijah was already one step ahead. By the time Emma had given the order, Elijah was already prepared for her retaliation. Within hours, the first smear articles appeared online, but they didn't have the desired effect. The narrative painted him as a grieving, disturbed teenager obsessed with his father's death. Yet, Elijah had anticipated this move. As soon as the first posts hit the internet, Elijah released a video. It was simple, just a grainy, unpolished clip of him sitting in his room, wearing his worn-out school uniform, his backpack casually resting by his side. But his presence, his calm demeanor, sent a message far more powerful than any attempt at defamation. "My name is Elijah King," he said directly to the camera. "I'm 15 years old, and my father, Detective Claire King, was killed 3 months ago while investigating corruption in military contracts. You'll soon hear people say I'm unstable, dangerous, even obsessed. But remember this, desperate people do desperate things. And the truth always comes out. His voice was steady, measured, and unflinching. As the video circulated, it quickly gained millions of views. His calmness in the face of media manipulation had an unexpected effect: public sympathy. People began to rally behind him. His story was compelling, the underdog challenging the powerful elite. Within 6 hours, the video had reached over 2 million views, and the narrative had shifted. The media, once casting him as a troubled teen, now saw him as the embodiment of a David versus Goliath story. The public wasn't just watching a teenager seek revenge, they were witnessing a fight for justice. Emma watched helplessly as her PR team scrambled. They tried to fight back with more negative stories, attempting to paint Elijah as mentally unstable. But each effort only fueled the fire. With every defaming headline, the public's empathy for him grew stronger. Then, another envelope arrived on Emma's desk, containing a flash drive. She hesitated for a moment before inserting it into her computer. The files on the drive were even more damning than she feared. There were audio recordings of her discussing bribes with senators, emails detailing the deliberate sending of defective military equipment into war zones, and photos of her meeting with a fixer, someone known for helping her erase problems. The most chilling photo was from just 2 days before her husband's death, showing her shaking hands with Victor Klov, the same fixer responsible for covering up the death of General King. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized the full extent of what Elijah had. He hadn't been bluffing. She slammed her fist on the desk in anger. This wasn't just a kid with a vendetta. This was a calculated operation, one that had already destroyed her public image. Elijah had manipulated the media, had placed her in the spotlight at her most vulnerable. She had underestimated him, and now the consequences were more severe than she ever imagined. At that moment, her phone rang. It was her lawyer. "Ms. Westbrook, you need to see this," he said urgently. "The article is already written. Kenneth Morrison is on standby, ready to publish." The headline reads, "The Billionaire Who Killed a General." Emma felt her world collapse around her. The article was set to go live the next day at 6 a.m. With the press already on her trail, it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. She was already a pariah, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. The next morning, as promised, the article was published. The headline splashed across every news outlet: "The Billionaire Who Killed a General." By 7 a.m., the FBI had received the damning evidence of corruption, murder, and attempted murder that Elijah had gathered. The stock price of Blackstone Defense, her crown jewel, plummeted. Investors fled. Emma's allies distanced themselves. By the time the markets opened at 9 a.m., her empire was in shambles. Emma couldn't stop the tide that was washing over her. She had built her wealth on backroom deals, shady contracts, and underhanded tactics. But now, it all seemed worthless. She had power once, but the truth, no matter how well hidden, had come for her. And there was nothing she could do to escape it. Her phone rang again. It was a call from her private investigator. "Ms. Westbrook," he said, his voice grim. "We've tracked all of Elijah's movements. He's not working alone. We've discovered another layer to this operation. The military veterans backing him aren't just bodyguards. They've been collecting information on you, on Blackstone, on every crooked deal you've ever made." Emma's stomach turned. "How many?" "At least 18 veterans, Ms. Westbrook," Barnes continued. "And they've been following your every move. There's a lot more we haven't uncovered yet, but we believe they've been preparing for this for years." Emma realized she was cornered. She had no more tricks left. The game had already been decided. She had spent decades building her empire on corruption and deceit, but now she was faced with the consequences of her actions, and they were far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. She hung up the phone, her mind racing, but there was one thing she knew for sure. She had underestimated Elijah King. This wasn't just the story of a boy avenging his father's death. It was the story of a master strategist, using everything he had learned from his father to dismantle her empire and expose the truth. As the day went on, things only worsened for Emma. The FBI had begun seizing documents and computers from Blackstone Defense's offices, while the media blitz continued, painting her as a ruthless billionaire responsible for the deaths of soldiers. Her connections were falling apart, her allies turning their backs on her. She had tried to discredit Elijah, but he had already planned for everything. At 4 p.m., she received a final message from Elijah. "You have 24 hours, Ms. Westbrook. If you want to end this without destroying what little remains of your reputation, you know what to do. Don't make me wait any longer." It was the last straw. Her empire was crumbling. Her freedom was slipping through her fingers, and Elijah had her in a position she couldn't escape. She called her lawyer, her voice shaking. "Prepare the documents. I'll do what he wants." But as she signed away the shares of Blackstone Defense, transferring 51% to the Veterans Fund Elijah had orchestrated, she realized that Elijah had already won. It wasn't just about the money, it was about justice. He had exposed everything: the corruption, the manipulation, the lives lost because of her greed. And she had no way of stopping him. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Emma Westbrook's downfall continued to shake the foundations of the business world. Her empire was in ruins, but the public's view of Elijah had solidified. The story of a 15-year-old boy, once an orphan, who brought down one of the most powerful corporate figures in the world, became a legend. The media called him the general's son, the boy who transformed grief into justice. Meanwhile, Elijah focused on his work. The General King Fund had become a powerful force for change. With the shares from Blackstone Defense, he was able to provide better equipment for soldiers, fund investigations into corruption, and support the families of those who had died from the defective equipment that Emma had profited from. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about creating a legacy that would outlast her, that would outlast them all. Elijah's team, a group of veterans who had served under his father's command, became his closest allies. They operated in the shadows, constantly monitoring any attempt to reverse the damage done to Blackstone Defense, and making sure that the funds meant for soldiers reached their intended targets. Elijah worked tirelessly, his mind constantly shifting between military strategy, legal battles, and social reforms. One morning, as Elijah sat in his small office, his attention was drawn to a news segment on the television. The anchor was reporting about a new wave of corruption cases being uncovered, all tied to military contracts, weapons testing, and shady government dealings. Elijah smiled. The satisfaction of seeing his father's work continued coursing through him. The fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. The General King Fund, now worth billions, became a central part of their investigation. It wasn't just about providing support anymore. It was a tool, a resource, a beacon for those who were willing to expose the truth. Elijah's network expanded rapidly, with veterans, investigative journalists, and former government officials joining forces. This wasn't just a rebellion against a single woman or a single company. It was a fight for the future of the country, for accountability, and for justice. As the investigation deepened, Elijah uncovered something even more unsettling: a pattern of systematic corruption that had existed for decades. His father's death had been just one tragic incident in a much larger scheme. And it wasn't just limited to the military. Corruption reached deep into politics, business, and even law enforcement. The realization hit him hard. His father had been right all along. He had died because he had been too close to uncovering a vast conspiracy, one that not only killed soldiers, but had compromised the very safety of the country. With this knowledge, Elijah felt a sense of urgency. The truth couldn't wait any longer. The world needed to know what was happening behind the scenes. But to do so, they needed more than just evidence. They needed proof that could bring the entire operation down, from the top to the bottom. Elijah and his team began putting together a massive exposé. They had gathered enough evidence to implicate the highest levels of government, defense contractors, and military officials. Every document, every recording, every witness, everything was meticulously cataloged. The final piece of the puzzle came when they infiltrated a secret meeting between government officials and a shadowy group of businessmen who were involved in the largest arms deals the world had ever seen. Elijah had known this moment would come, and he was ready. The night before the exposé was scheduled to drop, Elijah stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the collar of his jacket. His eyes were as steely as ever, but there was something else in them now, a quiet resolve. For the first time in a long while, he thought about his mother, about the lessons she had taught him, about how far he had come since the day he lost both of his parents. The road to this point had been long, filled with pain and loss, but also with growth. He had built something greater than his father had ever dreamed. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. He checked his watch. The countdown was about to begin. The article would go live at 6 a.m. It would expose the corruption in military contracts, the deals that had been made in the shadows, the lives that had been lost for profit. But more importantly, it would reveal the names of those responsible, the people who had thought they were untouchable, the people who had thought they could get away with anything. At 6 a.m., when the article was published, the world would see them for who they truly were. Elijah's phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a message from Kenneth Morrison. "It's all set. Let's do this." He nodded to himself. Tomorrow, the game would change. The corrupt would be held accountable, and Elijah King would finally fulfill the legacy of his father, General Marcus King, whose spirit had guided him every step of the way. Elijah glanced at the framed photo on his desk again, this time with a sense of peace. His father had trained him for this moment, prepared him for this war. And now, Elijah was ready to finish what his father had started. With the weight of his father's legacy on his shoulders, Elijah stepped away from the mirror. He was no longer just a boy. He was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was about to find out that justice, real justice, was coming for them all. As he walked toward the door, ready to change the world, one truth at a time, the question